welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you here. It is Sunday, August 24th, and we are under 1 week from the start of the college football season for the Indiana Hoosiers. We just had some college football played for the first time this year, a smorgasbord, a poo-poo platter of games for that first day, varying quality. Couple of good games, couple of games that were really entertaining that bookended the day, and the weather outside is feeling more fall-like. It feels like all the stars are aligning. We've got Taylor Lehman back after his vacation. He's ready to go to talk IU football. I'm excited. Everybody's excited. Taylor, it's been a long spring and summer awaiting this IU football team coming back onto the field, and we're almost there. How you feeling about everything?
I'm good. I'm holed up in my apartment, getting everything ready for Bison, revisiting some things I was doing last year. And I told you this off air, but it's a lot like writing, where you go back and you reread some old things that you've written. You're like, man, I could have done this a lot better. I'm doing that with my code now. So I'm trying to get everything straight after vacation, which was a great vacation. Wouldn't change anything in that regard, but would like to have a little more time before kickoff. But no, I'm very excited. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, and which is interesting. I know there was excitement last year going into 2024, but this feels a bit different from like a macro sense.
Yeah, it's one of those fascinating things where, as we get our mind around this season, putting ourselves back in the mode of what we thought last season was, is an interesting exercise. And obviously we're going to have a full week of football preview podcast to talk through our feelings, our thoughts, our aspirations for IU, the things that we might be concerned about. But it just, the fundamental floor of where our thoughts are at is very different from what it was last year. Last year, I think I predicted 8-4 in the regular season, and I felt like I was going way out on a limb for that. And yet this year, you just feel like they've kept a lot of great pieces. They've added some pieces. You're expecting some natural progression. And I think last year just demonstrated that, as Kurt Cignetti often says, you don't need to have any self-imposed limitations, even as an analyst or a fan with IU football. But it's hard to get your head wrapped around that as someone who's followed IU football. The proverbial Lucy pulling the football, of teams, generally speaking. So I'm excited to see how all this plays out, and I'm trying my best not to temper my expectations, because what's the point? How would that be fun, right?
Yeah. Also, take comfort in the fact that there's more money here now.
Yeah.
More money does not always mean a good football team, but in this regard, I think you can take some comfort in the fact that money can buy some talent, which we saw with CJ West last year.
It's money's not a bad thing.
No.
And only the people without it complain in college football, and there's a reason for that. So I think ultimately, as we move forward, that's going to be a big element that we want to keep an eye on, but it's also the development. It's also being able to target the right people. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today as we start our week of podcasts by focusing on a segment that Taylor and I got started. I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago. I think it was last year.
2 years ago.
It was 2 years ago. So I was right the first time. But the over-unders, where we look at IU and ask ourselves, what could they do? How might it work? And what are some key stats to keep an eye on that might be good indicators of what's going on with this team? So we're going to dive into that today. We'll have a couple of other items that we'll dive into as well. But before we get to that, just a couple of programming notes, folks. First, we have a new show launching on, I think, what's going to be Monday evening, and you're going to want to catch this one. It is The Big Red Carpet with Rhett Lewis. Rhett Lewis, of course, you know him from IU Football Radio. He did the color commentary for a couple of years. He's on Big Ten Network Sideline now and has covered multiple games, including last year's game against Washington, which was quite an experience all the way around. And then you add in, of course, Rhett's been with the NFL Network for many years. The man knows his football, and he is going to be dishing on Mondays on IU football, what to expect with the upcoming week, looking back at the previous week. It's going to be a lot of fun. We actually just recorded the first segment of that show recently, and I think you're going to enjoy what you're hearing and seeing out of that. So we'll have a permanent time in the schedule coming up soon, but look for it on Monday evenings on the Back Home Network. You can go to YouTube and see it on the Back Home Network channel, so be sure to subscribe there. But it's also got its own Spotify and Apple instances. You can go to Spotify and just search Big Red Carpet, hit that follow button, and join the folks who will be getting that delivered right to their inbox. So go ahead and check that out. I think you're going to enjoy what you see. Also, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. They just opened a store on Kirkwood, Taylor. I don't know if you've been abroad. I doubt you've had a chance to come down and check out the location yet. But I got, finally, this shirt, which I've been hoping to get, the 79 Fighting Hoosiers Block Eye helmet shirt at that store. It's all IU stuff in there. And, of course, it's in the famous Tracks location that undergrads and grad students and faculty have been frequenting for the last 35, 40-plus years. So head down to Kirkwood, check out the new Home Field at Tracks store, and I think you're going to enjoy it. And, of course, you can always order online at homefieldapparel.com. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. All right, Taylor, let's go ahead and dive into the fun, as we've got a lot of over-unders that we wanted to hit. You sent me 4, I sent you 4. And, the idea behind this, folks, is we try to find statistical elements that we think are going to be interesting. And we try to pick numbers that are kind of right in the midst of where we think they might be. And, last year, it was an interesting process, kind of seeing how all of it was going to work out. This year, we were in a different category, I feel like, with some of these numbers. So we're going to start with Taylor's numbers first. And the reason I say different category is it feels like there's just a little bit of a higher aim, not just in terms of what IU has done historically, but also where they're going to place nationally. But we're going to start with some numbers that are a little more IU-centric. So, Taylor, we're going to start with yours. And the first one that we had was over under 39.5 receptions by Indiana tight ends. So give me some context as to why you thought that this was going to be a good question, and then we'll talk about our answers.
Yeah, there weren't, I don't remember the exact number, the exact numbers, but Zach Horton, I was kind of expecting him to have more targets last year, and then it kind of fell off as the year went on. He definitely became more of like a dynamic blocker in the run game, which was great. He was fantastic, and when he was targeted, he did well. But they added Holden Stace and Riley Nowakowski, and I've written a lot. I can't say credit for identifying this trend myself. Dan Casey made a book, and he is a second iteration of trends in football.
Which I bought on your recommendation. I've been working my way through. It's an excellent.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
it's great. It has like QR codes, and you can view them online and things. And one of the things he noted was with Oregon, and he noted that a lot more of like a 12 personnel packages are being used, and which means two tight ends.
The 2 tight end package, absolutely, yeah.
Yep, 2 tight end packages, which I kind of anticipated seeing more from Indiana last year, but now I really do, because they added Holden Stace and Riley Nowakowski, and so I was watching those two, and I assumed, in the spring, if one of them left, we would kind of see more of the 1 tight end sets. But now that they're both here, I can't imagine they're just not going to have them both on the field frequently. So I don't think they're going to be living in that, but I think it's helpful to have what's called a move tight end, somebody who has mobility and can move and block, but also work in the passing game, and kind of a big bodied receiver. And then a more inline tight end like Nowakowski or like a James Bamba. And that's kind of what Zach Horton became as well. So I think, Nowakowski will kind of serve as more of that inline blocking tight end, while Holden Stace is the kind of the big bodied receiver. And I think, I can't remember how long. I think it was 2021 when Peyton Hendershot and AJ Barner combined for 60 receptions. And that was the last time they hit that. They'd have to reach 40 receptions by tight ends for this to be over. I am taking the over, just because of the presence of tight ends and also the talent of the 2 tight ends. I just think that you pull them from Tennessee / Notre Dame with Stace, and then Wisconsin with Nowakowski. You're going to use those guys. You're going to use talented tight ends. So I'm pretty optimistic. You know how much I love tight ends. Anybody who's been reading my stuff or listening to me on here knows I love tight ends and what that shows about an offense. So I think it's going to be, especially with Tyler Morris going down too, I think that's going to be significant.
Yeah, I went slightly under on this. Indiana had 23 catches total by tight ends last year. And That's a really low number if you look at other similarly efficient offenses that we saw last season. And I think there were a lot of factors that went into that. Obviously, Curtis Rourke had to get rid of the ball quickly, especially as the season went along because of some offensive line issues. You also had, I think, a problem where you could use Horton in the passing game, but you had to use him in the running game. And Indiana was so RPO heavy. They ran the ball a ton last year. 2 running backs over 140 carries on the season, that it just made more sense given the way that offense flowed. I think there will be more receptions by tight ends. I think there'll be more targets, but I also get the sense that there may be more depth at wide receiver, and they're going to use more of the field. And you've also potentially got some more catches perhaps coming out of the backfield, as you've got Lee Beebe, who's going to be in there as a change of pace back. You're going to have Kalen Black, who I think can catch the ball a bit out of the backfield as well. So even though I think the tight end catches are going to be in the 35 to 37 range, but I couldn't quite get myself to 40, which is what I need for the over on this. But I think it's going to be pretty tight.
Yeah, I'll add, Galen, and I tweeted this out yesterday as I was doing some research for some other things, but Roman Hemby has the 3rd most receptions by running backs in the last 3 seasons. He's definitely going to be used in the passing game. All 3 of the running backs can catch, and they've proven so. They have it in the resumes, but Roman Hemby is very consistent in the passing game. I think that's a good note that there are going to be more passes. I think Justice Ellison led running backs in Indiana's backfield with 13 catches, and just for reference, I think Roman Hemby had 40 last year. So they're going to be involved in the passing game, and that could take targets away from the tight ends. Although I think the wide receiver room might be a little more shallow this year than it was last year.
This is going to be the big question, and I know that there's the jury is still out in terms of the actual performance of EJ Williams. We're not sure how Jonathan Brady is going to integrate in, or Mekhi Jackson. There's a lot of question marks as far as the slot. I do think that you're going to see more targets of Omar Cooper Jr. You're going to probably see. The other thing about this is will the tight ends be used in a way where if Mendoza has to scramble to avoid pressure, there's regular dump offs there, or are they going to be running the tight end more downfield, especially with Stace? There's just a lot of unknowns with how they're going to actually scheme around these guys. And I think ultimately it's just going to be one of those things where we'll have to wait and see how good the protection is. Can the offensive line handle things where you could get an extra person out into catching a ball? I'm really fascinated to see how that plays out. Let's go to our second one from you, which was over under 375 rushing yards for Fernando Mendoza. I'll go ahead and jump on this one first and say I had the under on this by a fairly significant amount, in as much as we know Mendoza can scramble. That's been part of the conversation around him. He didn't rush as much as you would have thought in terms of total yards last year at Cal, behind a bad offensive line. I think he had 140 yards. And this is also where rushing yards for quarterbacks in college, unless you're Riley Leonard or somebody like that, are problematic, because if you get sacked, the yardage comes out of your rushing total, as opposed to in the NFL when it comes out of the passing total. So I have a hard time seeing, with all the wealth of targets that IU's got, and arguably perhaps a better offensive line than last year, a situation where Mendoza racks up that many yards. So that was my rationale for going under on this one.
I'm also going under, and I think the reason I set up this line was because I kind of thought of the rushing quarterbacks in the past who have actually been healthy enough to put together a full season resume, which we're all hoping Fernando Mendoza can do. And 375 would be right in between Peyton Ramsey in 2018 and Trey Roberson in 2013. So I thought that was a good delineation between those two, because Peyton Ramsey wasn't necessarily a running quarterback. He just ran because he kind of had to at some points. Right. Trey Roberson was a lot more athletic, and Indiana's had athletic quarterbacks. They just got injured, which is kind of part of my point here with the under, is you don't want Fernando Mendoza running that often, especially as often as it takes to reach 375 yards. And Galen, I have some good news with the sacks yardage coming out of the rushing, which is PFF provides non-sack yardage.
Oh.
And so you'll Mendoza has 531 career non-sack rushing yards, so 531. only 150 of them have come from designed carries. So he just scrambles. He was scrambling a ton at Cal. He was running all over the place, which is great for that boy nice watchers, you know. but the I will say 531 for his career non-sack rushing yards is just barely more than Peyton Ramsey had in total rushing yardage in 2018. He was actually over 500 yards non-sack yardage, and so you know, I think it just takes a lot. It takes a lot, and I think it takes a lot of carries, and we don't want Mendoza carrying the ball that much. And also on top of it, like we were just talking about, there are 3 running backs in the backfield that can handle this workload. You don't have to put it on Mendoza. So while he can definitely, you know, move forward in the RPO and in ways that were visibly not used with Curtis Rourke because he had a torn ACL, he can take advantage of some of those plays, but you really don't want him to. And I think Mike Shanahan and Chandler Whitman are going to be telling him that too. They're going to be like, hey, you need to protect yourself. We have people who can make plays. Just get them the ball.
Yeah. So both of us had under on that one. Let's move on to another rushing related statistic. Over under 140 carries for Roman Hemby. Of course, Roman Hemby, the transfer coming in from Maryland, had a couple of really good years in a row there. A lot of people are excited. What were your thoughts on this one?
I have the over, and I think so 140 carries, that would be roughly the same as Tyson Lawton had in last year and just behind what Justice Ellison had. And this is actually a mark that Roman Hemby has hit twice and almost hit a third time last year. I feel for Roman Hemby, and the fact that Indiana pulled him was just so surprised. That's how you know this program's on a different level. I never would have imagined that they would pull a Roman Hemby from Maryland or could afford him. And so I think he's the number 1 running back. I think he's gunning for an NFL opportunity. And I think, you know, he's somebody who is just really consistent and volume based. And when you look at his numbers, the amount of times he's carried the ball is insane, but he almost hit 1,000 rushing yards as a redshirt freshman at Maryland. And the offensive line has deteriorated at Maryland, so where he's basically running into a wall of defenders for the last 2 years. He's going to have something a little bit better. He's going to have like an offensive line that can actually get a push. And so I think, you know, looking at the other 2 running backs, I know Lee Beebe is a little bit banged up right now to start, and Kalon Black, he has some durability issues. You know, we don't know if there's going to pop up again, but I think with those 2, I think the carry is going to be there for Roman Hemby. The touches are going to be there in the passing game. So I don't think they're going to run him into the ground by any means, but I think over 140 is a reasonable expectation given how much they ran last year too.
Yeah, I had the over on this. This has been a consistent thing, not just with Hemby, but also with the way that Shanahan's offenses have gone. They, ended up, Kalon Black had over 140 carries at JMU in 2023. I think he was their leading carrier that year. The one thing with this that I saw and it kind of goes back to what you just said about the issues with the Maryland offensive line. I'm curious who benefits more from transferring, Roman Hemby or Billy Edwards, who's at Wisconsin. It's probably going to be Roman Hemby just because I think clearly the structure around him is better at IU than what Edwards is going to have at Wisconsin. But I do worry a little bit. His yards per carry last year was 4.53. If it's around 4.5 again, I don't think he's going to get to 140 carries because I think they'll distribute the ball a bit more evenly amongst the other running backs. Because last year, I think Justice Ellison was at about a 5.2 yards per carry average, and I think Tyson Lawton was at about 4.8 or 4.9. 4.53 yards per carry would have been the worst among all the running backs that IU had last year. Mm-hmm. And so I am with you in that I am betting that the revamped and better offensive line he'll be running behind, plus the design of the offense, is going to give him the opportunity to be up in that 5 yards a carry average. But I think if it's about halfway through the season and he's not there yet, that's where some problems could come in on this number.
I think it's also pretty roles based too. I think Lee Beebe, you're going to see a lot of red zone carries with him. Nobody can bring him down. He's insane. I'm very much looking forward to seeing him playing in an Indiana uniform. But I wrote about this in the Touts and Doubts that just released today for BSB2, and there's gonna be a lot of BSB content coming out, and including this. So if you can't keep up with what we're saying on the podcast, this is gonna come out on both of our Substacks too. So
right.
But with Roman Hemby, I think you're right, Galen. I think if it's not being efficient, he's not being productive. They have no qualms moving to another. We saw that last year with Justice Ellison. He was kind of falling off as the year was going on. Tyson Lawton ended up taking over that starting role in the last third of the season, maybe half the season, and so definitely. But I also think that one thing that might lend itself to Roman Hemby not getting 140 carries is that it might be pretty roles based, because there are three guys who can carry and they all can catch, and they're all strong and powerful. That's the thing that jumped out to me, is just the power. So yeah, I think there's, look at us making these great lines, right? The sportsbook should hire us. but yeah, I think there's room on either side of this line, but I do think Roman Hemby will be over.
Let's get to the last one that you put in, which was over under 24.5 sacks for Indiana's defense. And I'll start on this one. You go back to that 2020 season. I remember us talking about this last year. Indiana recorded 25 sacks in 7 games. It was a really good year. It was, and it was one of those where you expected Tom Allen run teams to have better production in terms of sacks. They had a great first year under Allen. I think they had like 37 sacks or something like that, but then it fell off, and it really fell off in those last 3 seasons under Allen, where they had 17 sacks in 21, 20 in 2022, and 20 in 23, and then 35 sacks last year, which is a huge delta between those 2 seasons, but ironically was a drop-off from what they had done at JMU the previous year, where they had 45 sacks recorded, which is an insane number at any level of football for a 12-game season. They lose, obviously, some production. James Carpenter's no longer here. Jalen Walker's no longer here. CJ West is no longer here. But they bring back Mikhail Kamara, who really feels like the linchpin of the pass rush. They add some intriguing new pieces. I know you talked about Indiana's defensive line as potentially being a real big strength. They were a strength last year as the season went along in the rushing defense area, and obviously they know how to get after the quarterback individually. So I'm over on this one, and I think that it may not be as good as last year just because there are fewer proven pieces, but I am really interested to see how far over they might be able to get. I think 25 or so feels like a nice baseline. I'm curious where they can get above that.
I was looking at these numbers, Gabe, and I agree with the over. I was looking at some of the numbers, and I was surprised at how James Carpenter, his season kind of rounded out. He was pretty quiet to start, but he ended up finishing, I think, second on the team with 6 sacks, and that was very impressive. And so losing him is not, that's not a small loss at all.
Right.
But I do think, and the reason why I bring that up is because I think with the multiplicity on the defensive front, which I think is going to be the biggest strength of this Indiana team, more so than anything on offense, I think the multiplicity on the defensive front, they can throw different looks at these opposing offenses. I think what it's going to do is spread the wealth, and I think we're going to see less of like, individual playmakers, maybe some regression with Mikhail Kamara, even with numbers wise, and more of just a whole unit coming at these offensive lines in the Big Ten, which is good, because I don't know if there are a lot of Big Ten offensive lines who we're super optimistic about. I guess the Penn State is a good one. Yeah. Oregon has a little bit of question, but Iowa, Illinois has a lot of continuity, but they weren't very good last year. So I struggle to think of an offensive line on this roster or on this schedule that can stop a defensive front that looks like it could be even stronger than last year. And last year it had the second highest havoc rate in the nation as a front seven. So we have no other choice but to pick the over here, because the line is at where they were last year.
Yeah. No, it's going to be interesting to watch that one transpire. And, the one other aspect I think that will be important in this is Indiana's offense. Can Indiana's offense put the opposing teams into a lot of situations where they're having to pass? That's going to lead to more opportunities for sacks, obviously, because you're not going to get sacks on running plays. And so if you see Indiana's offense as efficient or more efficient than they were last year, and they're continuing to score touchdowns and putting pressure on the opposition, that should allow whatever the front looks like for Indiana to tee off in a way that'll get that sack total up a ways. And I'm very fascinated to see how that plays out.
I'll say this, Galen. Kelly Ford, and I mentioned it in today's newsletter as well. Kelly Ford tried to predict one possession games, like how many one possession games each team will have. Indiana was very close to the bottom with just 3. And I assume those 3 are Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin. Those are the closest in win probability towards the 50% mark. But that would mean that Oregon and Penn State would be more than one possession worth of a loss. And then all the others would be, and how many would that be? That'd be, I'm trying to do quick math here. 7 games.
7, yeah.
Yeah, 7 games where it would be more than one possession. So you have 7 games where maybe the opposing offense is trying to pass. So that's a really good point. I like that. I didn't think about that.
Let's jump over to another havoc-related statistic. This was the first one I sent you. Over under 99.5 total tackles for loss for Indiana's defense. I'll let you start with this one.
Yeah, so Indiana was already 16th in the nation last year here. They had 95.
Kind of blew my mind when I went back and looked at that number. I wasn't expecting it to be that high.
Yeah, and so, but that's only 5 behind, and yeah, only 5 behind what you set the line at here. And so I looked at who they were losing, or what kind of production. They lost. James Carpenter had 12. Again, a little surprising to me. And then Jalen Walker had 10. And so those aren't small losses at all. They were second and third on the team in tackles for loss. But Elijah Hardy, I was looking at some of his production, Galen, and I'm trying to remember where I wrote those exact numbers, but he only played like 170 snaps, and he recorded, it was like he had 6 tackles for loss. He had like 2 interceptions. Everybody who watched the team last year knows Elijah Hardy is a havoc machine, and he's likely jumping into a Jalen Walker role. So not that Jalen Walker is easily replaceable at all, but Elijah Hardy has shown that he can get into a backfield and he can cause some havoc, which is exactly what we're talking about here. So I think Tyreek Tucker stepping in for CJ West, you're not seeing a whole lot of regression in these positions, and I would say even Hosea Wheeler replacing James Carpenter somewhat. I think you're not seeing a ton of regression where these key playmakers were ideally, and so I think that kind of prevented me from thinking that there was going to be a lot of regression in this category for them. Then they also added Kellen Wyatt for an edge presence, which is always huge for tackles for loss. But to say that, and also this is where I started looking at the opposing offensive lines too. I have a stat here, was like they have, so we can assume that they're going to rack up TFLs against non-conference opponents. They had 24 against their non-conference schedule, but they also have 5 conference opponents. Those teams are Purdue, Michigan State, UCLA, Maryland, and Iowa, that were all in the bottom half and percent of rushes that went for negative yards, which surprised me with Iowa because they had Caleb Johnson. Right. But those teams, they all didn't really work to improve their offensive line situation. So there's, you think that 5 conference teams, 3 non-conference teams, that's 8 total teams you can potentially really rack up some TFLs against. I think that's I think it makes Indiana a great candidate for actually improving here after being 16th in the nation.
Yeah, 100 tackles for loss has pretty much gotten you into the top 10 or better of college football each of the last 3 seasons. And that's where they were at JMU the year before this coaching staff came to IU. They had 114 in 2023, which again is insane. The loss of personnel, key personnel in this is certainly an issue, but I agree with you. The number of games they have against teams that are going to be pretty rickety on their offensive line, and or needing situations where they might take sacks, or they're rushing in situations where they can't really get the push that they need up front, should contribute, I think, really effectively to this. And look, ultimately, the tackles for loss stat isn't just a penetration statistic. It's also sometimes a coverage statistic, because if you can't find targets downfield, you're going to oftentimes take some losses because you're out of options. So I like it over, but barely. I wouldn't be shocked to see Indiana in the top 10 in tackles for loss this year, just given the talent that they added to the talent that they've got coming back. But I think it's going to be pretty close.
Yeah, and I'll add the thing. I'll re-add the multiplicity too, Galen. I think just having guys in the right position, which Bryant Haynes has shown that he can do. He created a pretty novel nose tackle scheme with CJ West last year that Tyreek Tucker slides right into. And then Dominic Ratcliffe, I've heard really good things about him coming out of camp. So, they're just so deep on the interior defensive line. And they also added some extra edge presence, which I was really happy to see. So yeah, I struggle to see where they have regression this year versus last year.
Yeah. Let's go to the next one, which is an offensive stat. Over under 69.5 yards receiving per game for Elijah Sarratt. It was interesting when I was digging into this one. There haven't been many IU receivers in the last decade that have broached or breached that 70 yards per game mark. It's Elijah Sarratt last year, Cam Camper a couple of years ago, Ty Freifogel, Simi Cobbs, and Nick Westbrook. Like, that's it since the last year of Kevin Wilson. Last year was interesting because Sarratt was clearly Curtis Rourke's favorite target. They had an amazing rhythm that they locked into, and that gave Sarratt a lot of yards every game that he probably might not have gotten if either A, Rourke had a little more time in the pocket or a little more mobility, or B, you had, I think, more trust built amongst the other receivers in the mix. So I'm expecting Omar Cooper, for instance, to have his yards per game go up. You mentioned the tight end options. We're also still kind of questioning what comes out of the backfield. So I think that you'll probably see a slight reduction in Sarratt's overall yards per game, but I think he'll probably still get over that 70 yards per game average because he's just that quality of a receiver, and it's just hard for other teams to cover him effectively.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious also, Galen, in addition to all the questions that you noted where the targets are going, is last year Indiana had two slot receivers that they used frequently. There would be a lot of two slot receiver sets. They looked to Keyshawn Williams a lot towards the end of the season when things were breaking down. Miles Price had some injury issues, but he could do a lot of the schematic stuff that Mike Shanahan really liked to do. I think Jonathan Brady might step into a role like that. But that kind of brings me to the point where are there going to be two slot receivers this year? Or is Mekhi Jackson stepping into the second slot role, or is he the number one slot role? I think he's kind of like a Miles Cross type, which means Jonathan Brady would be the only slot receiver unless we're expecting LeBron Bond to play.
Right.
So I think, if you only have one slot receiver, that leaves some targets on the table, which, as we were talking about, they might be distributed amongst the running back or they might go to the tight ends. But I think the targets should be there for Elijah Sarratt. I am actually curious to see if it's not necessarily a receiver stat, but it's the catch percentage. So the percentage of targets that the receiver actually catches. It's not always the receiver's fault for not catching a target. But he caught 63% of his targets, which was 79th amongst power four receivers. So a really low number. If more of those are completed this year, this might not even be a question. He might, reach that mark pretty easily, but also his yards per reception were very high. It was like over 18. And so that's a regression candidate this year as well. So I think it's right at that line, Galen. I think that was a really good line. I was struggling with, that was probably the line that I struggled the most with, is how many yards per game Elijah Sarratt's going to have. But I'm really curious to see how much he improves this year, because there were some points last year where I was kind of like, okay, where are you, Sarratt? Like, we kind of need you here. Yeah. We need you to be like a dominant receiver here. And sometimes he just didn't show. So I'm curious to see, if he becomes more of that. He's already a physical presence, but I like to see him be more of a physical presence on the perimeter.
I mean, obviously he had what I think is arguably the most important catch of the entire year for IU, which was that catch in the first half against Michigan that gave them what ultimately ended up being the margin of victory. But yes. Yeah, it's interesting because, you look down the stretch, that was his only catch in that Michigan game. And he only caught 3 balls against Ohio State. He caught 8 against Purdue, but everybody was catching balls against Purdue. And he only caught 4 against Notre Dame. And that was a real drop-off from what occurred earlier in the year, where I think, through the first 3 Big Ten games, he had 4 against UCLA, 7 against Maryland, and 7 against Northwestern. Now, was that because of Curtis Rourke's hand injury? That becomes the big question for me. Was he dropping balls, or were the balls just not of a good enough quality that he could regularly catch them? I don't think anybody really knows. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that rolls into this year. But I like the over in this one, but it could be tight because, as you mentioned, it's like a never-ending math equation trying to figure out all the variables that go into this particular statistic with him.
It's true.
Last couple here. Over under 17.5 sacks allowed by Indiana's offensive line this year. I'm going to have you take this one first.
Yeah, so I think people will enjoy reading what I wrote here, Galen. This line will be in your Substack. I wanted to take the over. You know, the 17.5 sacks allowed by Indiana. They I can't remember exactly how many they allowed last year, but they
allowed 21 last year.
They allowed 21, so that means, you know, if they allowed the same as last year, they would still be over. And I actually have some questions about their pass protection this year. I'm a little concerned about the right tackle position, to be honest. From some things I've seen coming out of camp and stuff, it looks like Khalil Benson might be competing with Zim Mikulski, and for the right tackle position, and that would mean that Benson would have either had to have been beaten out at right guard by either Johnny or Evans, which I don't think should happen. Or it means Mikulski, they're a little concerned about him at right tackle. And when you look at the way that either of those two guys has graded at right tackle in their careers, small sample size for Mikulski, but it's not been good. It's not been good at all. Not even close to good. It's been pretty abysmal, actually. And so it's going to be a journey for either of those two at right tackle in the first place. But if it's Benson, that's concerning to me too. And so, you know, I think the right side of this offensive line might struggle with some pass protection, which is not a great thing. Especially, I think, you know, Trey Wedig really held some things down there at right tackle. But then when I was looking through it, I was like, okay, you know, there are some questions on this offensive line, but who are they playing? And I was like, oh, okay, well, they have, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4. They had 4 teams on their schedule who were top 46 in sack totals last season. The rest were in the bottom 84. And I was like, okay, or maybe bottom 84 is not the best way to word that. They were
in the bottom third, basically, of FBS in sack rate.
Yeah. Exactly. And then, you know, none of them have really improved. And I would say actually Illinois got worse on its defensive front, on its defensive line in particular. So you know, I don't think there's really a team or a defense that's ready to take advantage of what Indiana of a shortcoming that Indiana might have on its offensive line. So I had to go with the under, which is kind of insane.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a rumor. This is where Bob Bostad deserves a ton of credit. You know, he took over an offensive line that in 2022 surrendered 38 sacks that season, which is just nuts. If you haven't apologized in some way to Connor Bazelak at this point, you probably should. It was a rough time period back there, but they go from 38 then to 21 sacks last year. So a 17 sack improvement allowed in 2 years. And I'm inclined to give Bostad the benefit of the doubt that he's really managed to forge this unit into shape and seems to really be able to make some remarkable improvements with guys. You're right about the right tackle position. It should be concerning to people right now, but I'm going to give Bostad the benefit of the doubt that maybe the competition really is actually that good. I mean, this is Khalil Benson's last crack at being a college offensive lineman. This is Zen Mikowski's first crack at being a bona fide Big Ten starter. And washing out at Ohio State compared to the folks that come in every year on that line is no crime. Yep. A whole offseason of working with Bostad is going to be helpful. And keep in mind, like, Benson did play a season under Bostad, but that was that first year that Bostad was in there, and there were a lot of missing pieces and a lot of, I think, ill-fitting pieces on the line during that. So I'm going to also go with the under, although by not much. There weren't a whole lot of teams that allowed that few sacks last year. So it's not impossible, and I like what you said about the teams that they're playing and the fact they may not have a huge amount of pressure. The other aspect here is obviously you don't have an injured quarterback, and you've got ostensibly more weapons, especially more check down type of weapons that you could use. That might also chip away at that number a little bit.
Yeah, I agree, Galen. I think the point about quarterback health is really important. and Mendoza's his natural ability to escape anyway, and not only that, his ability to throw on the run, I think, is huge. And so I think that's a strength that Curtis Work could do it. He's done it in his career, but he just couldn't do it last year. And so it's something that Fernando Mendoza is going to bring that Indiana didn't really have last year, which was somebody who is not only good at throwing on the run, but elite at throwing on the run. I'm very excited to see that. But yeah, that's a good point.
Last one, and this is more of a frivolous stat than anything, but over under 18.5 field goal attempts by Indiana's special teams this season. I uncovered a stat out of this as I was looking. Indiana was 128th last year out of 134 teams in field goal attempts. They only attempted 11 field goals. And I think, Alabama and Boston College were the only two teams in the power conference that attempted fewer field goals. Now, Alabama and Indiana kind of fit in the same category. Their offenses were just dominant enough that they didn't need field goals. And they were able to blow through the red zone oftentimes and score. That seems unlikely to be the case again, just by natural statistical regression. So I like the over here, just because if you look at the median number of field goal attempts for power, or for FBS teams, it's about 20.5 in each of the last few seasons. That feels more along the lines of what you should expect out of a normal year. Last year was just very abnormal.
Galen, I'll add to the stat that you found where they were 128th in the country in attempted field goals. They were 125th in punts.
Wow.
It was insane. But I did look into so Mike Shanahan has been the offensive coordinator for Cignetti since 2021. And I wanted to see if this is a pretty common trend for his offenses, and it is. They have, it's actually really funny. It lines up perfectly with your line. They haven't hit the over on this line, 18.5 field goals, since Mike Shanahan's first season in 2021 as the offensive coordinator, when they kicked 31. They had kicked 31 field goals, which would have been like top 5 in the country this year in attempted field goals. But since then, the highest that they've gone is 18.
Wow.
And so I was like, okay, well, I'll do the under. We'll see. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's just something to keep in the back of your head. And I feel like, especially early in the year, IU, they showed this last year too. They're willing to go for it on fourth down. They really like to put pressure on opponents. And I think the meta build for offenses in college football right now is along those lines. And it's really increasingly like that at the pro game as well, except in the pro game, you've got these robotic kickers who can hit 65-yarders now pretty regularly. And it's like, well, you hit 3 of those and you've essentially erased whatever touchdown the opposition has managed to put together. And then you also have to keep in mind that oftentimes those teams are playing against teams with much tougher defenses than Indiana might be facing in the majority of their schedule. So I'm taking the over simply because I feel like there's going to be enough games, especially on the road, where you might see Indiana's offense maybe not be as efficient. And I think they're pragmatic enough that they're going to want to get the points this year, knowing, I think, more about their offense and knowing that they've got a guy who's proven that he can lead comebacks and can put his team in a position in the fourth quarter where he can put them on his back and get down the field if necessary. You'd rather have the 3 points here or the 3 points there rather than always trying to go for it on fourth down. But I could easily see the under being what the actual answer is here.
Galen, I'll add something too, and this is just me being an annoying Detroit Tigers fan in 2025. But one of the things that makes the Tigers so successful is their base running and how much they actually just had their GM on the broadcast yesterday. I was watching the game. He was talking about applying pressure to opponents, and it's a growing trend in all of sports, not just baseball. Even though baseball is a lot more chance based than a football game necessarily, but I think when looking at those numbers I was just talking about with Mike Shanahan and the attempted field goals from his offenses, I think that is a conscious decision. I think when you are playing this game where you're applying pressure on all your opponents, you need to be consistent with it. And that, over time, the probability will be in your favor. And so that's another thing that I had in the back of my mind. I didn't write it in the piece, but I had it in the back of my mind when I was thinking, this does seem like a statistics-based decision based in probability, where if you continue this throughout a full season, it will lean in your favor. And so also Nico Radicich is not necessarily, he doesn't really have a big leg yet. He's still pretty young. So he's only attempted 3 field goals over 40 yards in his career. So, that also might have something to do with it too.
Yeah, no, there's a mentality aspect to this, and I think it both puts pressure on the defense, but it also gets your offense into the mindset of, we have 4 downs to get these yards. And we're going to use all of that. So I'm really fascinated to see how they approach things. I think Indiana's success, especially offensively this year, may largely ride on, we are going to be the aggressor because we have the players at the skill positions, and we feel good enough about our ability to execute our plays the way that we need to execute them. And we feel good about our defense enough that we're not worried if we end up leaving the ball at midfield that we might not get it back, because we probably will. So that's a nice spot to be in as a college football team. And you look at where Indiana's schedule is at, and there's a lot of teams that they can probably bully a bit in those circumstances and get some good returns off of it. So we'll see what happens. But that's our over-unders. You can catch the over-unders on both Crimson Cast Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com, and bitesizedbison.substack.com. If you haven't subscribed to Bite Sized Bison, what are you waiting for? The season's here. You want to keep up on the stats and the things going on. So go over, and there's still an active special for Crimson Cast listeners. You can see it on our Substack, but there's a special code you can use to sign up for a discounted Bite Sized Bison subscription. But that wraps up soon, right, Taylor?
It does. It only goes through August. So
yeah,
pretty much right through week 1, and then it's done.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I did want to talk a little bit about what you had in terms of your issue today, or your Substack today, the Touts and Doubts for Indiana football. What is catching your eye? Let's maybe pick 1 or 2 things on each side of this where you're excited about it, and then when you're not so excited or maybe concerned about it, I'll let you take the lead on this.
So the first thing that jumps out to me is something that, and the only reason it jumps out to me is because I haven't really heard people talk about it much, which is Brendan Franke, I think is how you pronounce his name, from Texas State, the kickoff specialist that they got through the portal. The kickoffs were awful for Indiana. They were one of the worst teams in the FBS and the Big Ten and kickoffs. And they had 4 guys attempt kickoffs. Obviously, they had an injury there, but even when he came back from the injury, he wasn't very good. But Quinn Warren actually graded the best. PFF does grade kickoff specialists. Quinn Warren graded the best, which was 129th in the FBS. And Brendan Franke graded 11th in the FBS. And when you look at the numbers, and I wrote the numbers in the piece today, it is pretty astounding. And the one that I will give is that 64 of his 79 kickoffs were touchbacks. In Indiana, they had 93 kickoffs, only 24 were touchbacks. And wow, it's nuts. There's a lot of other numbers in there that are much like that too, where Indiana clearly targeted this.
Well, you mentioned this in the piece. It's amazing. Franke last year surrendered 2.3 yards per kick. Indiana surrendered 9 yards per kick. And look, this is one of those hidden stats in football that most people don't think about. But the difference, that is essentially the difference between, let's just use, the touchback line's the 25. It's the difference between your opponent starting the ball or starting their drives at the 28-yard line versus starting at the 34. And that makes a big difference. I mean, that extra 9 yards or whatever, that's a field goal attempt versus a punt. That's an extra first down that the opposition has to pick up, and those add up. It's kind of like trying to lose weight or gain, if you're gaining weight. Like if you're eating 50 extra calories a day, you may not think anything of it, but you do that for a year and suddenly you've gained 5 pounds, and it doesn't seem like you actually did a whole lot to contribute to that. But that's essentially how you should think about these kickoff yards.
You have to work harder. Yeah. And I'm sure Cignetti and Haynes were pretty pissed every time a kickoff didn't work out, because I know for Quinn Warren and specifically, I think it was 46 or 48% of his kickoffs were actually returned, which is nuts. That number should be way lower. And so, and I write about all of that in the Touts and Doubts piece, but that's one small thing I wanted to touch on. But the big thing, honestly, Galen, and I've said it already, but I think that Indiana's strength is going to be its defensive front. And I wrote about all of that in here. But the one thing that I think that I did notice in the spring game was that they added so much size on the defensive front. That was one thing, especially in the Notre Dame game for some reason, maybe because Notre Dame was such a big team. But they, what you're seeing on the screen is Indiana's EPA per rush last week in the back half of the season, or last year in the back half of the season, was just insane compared to all these are college football playoff teams, but even non-college football playoff teams. It was insane. The difference, and that I would say is primarily it is good players, but it is primarily Bryant Haynes' scheme and the way that he schemed CJ West into there, the way that he schemed James Carpenter into and continued to work him into it. And that's why Carpenter had a good second half. But Indiana actually finished with the best EPA allowed per rush as well, season long, just not at this difference.
I mean, it's not an argument. It's just a reality. Indiana doesn't go to the playoff last year if their defensive front doesn't get so stout in that last half of the season. And again, the Michigan game to me is the one that highlighted that the most, because Indiana's offensive line got really dominated in that game. It was an unfortunate harbinger of what happened in the Ohio State game, but their defensive line really kept them in both of those games. And as much as the memory of what everybody will have from that Notre Dame game is that 99-yard rush that essentially broke it open, the stats from the rest of that game highlight how good Indiana's defensive line was and how hard they were to run against. Like, they really stymied Notre Dame. You take that rush out, and that's a much more even game. It still counted, so we can't do anything about it. But it felt like they had two plays all year that were backbreakers that masked how good they were. That one, and then the run at the end of the Ohio State game, which it basically inflated that margin back up to whatever it was, 38-15. So I'm with you on that. I think that's absolutely an area that IU fans should be excited about, and I'm really fascinated to see how these new additions and how this size equates to the overall performance of IU. Because let's be frank, big, mobile, athletic defensive lines, that is something for other people. That is not something that Indiana has ever. I can't remember the last time Indiana, maybe the Pinstripe Bowl team, because that was, Kevin Wilson did a good job of attracting those types of players. They were really good about picking good physical archetypes. This staff's going about it in a slightly different way, but the outcome might be somewhat similar.
Galen, can I add a couple things to that? I will say one thing Notre Dame took advantage of that no other team seemed to take advantage of was they basically used short passes to get behind the defensive front and then forced the third level defenders to tackle those superior athletes. And it didn't work out. And Indiana, even Amari Farrell struggled to tackle. But Indiana has added Power 5 safeties and to its defense now. I want to talk about this in a second, but Lewis Moore, his eligibility. But that's notable that Indiana added that type of talent. And could I ask you to share on the screen the red zone defense with the blue and gray circles?
I had that coming up next year. Let me. This is what happens when you always produce your own shows, folks, because you never know what Taylor's going to throw at you. But there you go.
So this screen here, this chart, it shows on the x-axis is defensive EPA per play in the red zone. This is all red zone based, and this is where I think the size really comes into play. So then on the y-axis, it is score percentage allowed in the red zone, and you can see that Indiana actually didn't allow many valuable plays in the red zone, but they did allow a significant number of scoring. And when I looked into the numbers deeper, and of course, I should say on this graph, the red circle is Indiana versus the blue ones being the Big Ten and the gray ones being the rest of the FBS teams. You can see that Indiana, they actually had a pretty low score rate allowed, or a pretty high score rate allowed in the red zone. And that's something that Bryant Haynes has pointed out specifically in the offseason. He said it in Under the Hood with Rhett Lewis that Kurt Cignetti kind of half joked with him about needing to be better in the red zone defensively next season. And one of the things I dug into the numbers just a little bit, and I found that touchdowns in the red zone represented 53% of the points allowed by Indiana's defense in 2024. They were third in the country with the fewest attempts in the red zone allowed, just 32, but 18 of them resulted in touchdowns. And so that's a concerning number. You don't want that. That's notable. So this is definitely something that adding the size, adding the multiplicity, this is definitely something that Brian Haynes had in the back of his mind when he was like, okay, where do I need to benefit or where do I need to improve this roster and this defense this season? The red zone was probably at the heart of that. And I think this is something that I actually have this in my tout. I think they're going to be a much better red zone defense this season.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be another layer to add to this defense and what it can do, and I think they're going to need it, especially in certain games. They're going to need it against Oregon. They're going to need it against Penn State. You're probably going to need it against Illinois to some degree. Those teams are going to move the ball some on you. What do you do when that happens is going to be a really interesting question.
And then the last point I want to pull from the touts and doubts piece, Galen, was a doubt, and it was about safety depth. And this is this is something that I've been thinking about, most of the offseason, especially after the transfer portal additions, which, they added Devon Boykin from NC State. They added Lewis Moore, who we're already familiar with from Ole Miss. They retained Amari Farrell, and then they retained Bryson Bonds, who is definitely more of a depth addition, special teams guy. But then they had behind them, it's just all young guys, and Byron Baldwin's probably the most notable one of those young guys. So I was already a little concerned because there are 3 safety positions, including Rover. That's the room that Rover comes out of. And Rover last year was really taken over by Terry Jones, and Terry Jones was kind of a bigger safety, almost a linebacker, and that's how he was used. He was used very close to the line. He had the most defensive line alignments of all safeties in the FBS, and so that's something that I was thinking about. And so as I was thinking about the multiplicity of this defense and what could happen, I think the Rover is going to be on the field much less often than it was last year. And so, if Lewis Moore, I've heard that Devon Boykin's been taking a lot of snaps at safety next to Amari Farrell. A lot of that I think is related to the Lewis Moore eligibility thing. And if Lewis Moore does come back, I think Devon Boykin still has a case to be a starting safety next to Amari Farrell. He's very good. I think that's one player that a lot of folks aren't talking about, but he is getting some noise like internally in the college football networks, and as somebody who is talented. So I think Devon Boykin could potentially be somebody who does start at safety, but also, I think Byron Baldwin might end up stepping into that Rover position, especially if Lewis Moore isn't back. And, taking the Rover off the field more often when there's a true freshman in that position makes a lot more sense. Yeah. And so, there could be safety depth here if I anticipate them doing that even with Lewis Moore. They would rotate safeties. They would probably always have Amari Farrell on the field, but between Lewis Moore and Devon Boykin. And so the safety situation is really interesting to me. Indiana benefited from not having any injuries at safety last year, which was huge for this team. So, that's still a question mark to me too. And I don't even know, we know that the team doesn't know exactly what they have there yet. So right. That'll definitely be something that we witness on the fly.
Yeah, you've been on this from the beginning, not just this, but the secondary in general. I know another one of your doubts was also in a position in the secondary. This is where having a long runway in those first few games, I think, helps, because it will allow IU to work out some kinks, figure out who they can rely on or who they think they can rely on, and get people comfortable with roles. I do wonder if you see a slight shift in scheme and the way that IU has decided to approach using not just the secondary, but that Rover position, because obviously they've already made a couple of alterations. You talked about Mikael Kamara moving into more of a pure edge position. That's different. And, I think one of the hallmarks of any good coaching staff is adapting your system to whatever personnel strengths and weaknesses you have, because you want to hide the weaknesses and emphasize the strengths. And we know Indiana's, I think, they're not going to be perfect across the board. They just don't have that level of talent to be able to do that. There's going to be some masking they have to do here. And it's one of those where it may not show up that much against many of the teams that Indiana plays. And to some degree, they're fortunate because the tests come at the end of September and then you get another test in October and then you get another test in November. The idea there is I think they're going to have to learn a lot quickly from that game against Illinois, because that will really dictate how they handle a lot of this against Iowa, Oregon, and Penn State.
Yep, I would definitely recommend Indiana fans to watch the experimentation that's happening on the defensive side of the ball, because Kellen Wyatt, when you look at Kellen Wyatt is the first one that comes to mind, Galen, when you talk about scheme change and experimentation. He's a pure edge guy. He could line up as a defensive end with his hand on the ground, or he could line up as an outside linebacker, but he'll be on the edge and in space. And he's actually close in size to Mikhail Kamara too. So that's a presence they didn't have on defense last year. And so I could definitely see them, kind of slotting him into like a similar Terry Jones position and taking the rover off the field and using him as somewhat of like a third linebacker, fifth defensive lineman type of situation. So yeah, and then look for whenever the rover's on the field, when he's off the field, and what those offenses look like across from those defenses, because those are the keys that they're reading is personnel. And so in the non-conference, it's really important to watch those things, because those, like you're saying, Galen, with the runway, that's what they're going to be looking for. That's what they'll be looking for in the players too. In terms of like learning the roles, maintaining the roles. It's different than you can win a job in fall camp, but you have to bring that onto the field too. So, it's going to be interesting, because they actually have a couple significant games right after the non-conference schedule. And like you were saying, Illinois and Iowa, those are going to be two big games, and they need to know kind of what their best defense is at the time.
Lot to be interested in and keep an eye on as we move through the early part of the season. So don't snooze through those first few games, folks. You're going to learn a lot if you're paying attention to the right things. Taylor, really appreciate it. We'll obviously get a chance to kind of see where we start on a lot of these numbers at the live show on September 5th at the Buskirk-Chumley Theater in Bloomington. You can get your tickets by going to the Buskirk-Chumley website. We've also got the link on our Substack. We've also got it up on the X account as well, so be sure to check all that out. Taylor, as always, a pleasure. Great talking football with you again as we start this week leading into week one for Indiana. We will obviously keep an eye on what's going on with you, and we'll talk to you probably next week.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Taylor Lehman from Bite-Size Bison joining us here on the show. We appreciate you folks tuning into Crimson Cast. As always, we'll have plenty of preview podcasts throughout the course of the week, plus other shows on the Back Home Network, including the Big Red Carpet and Crimson Cash on Thursday. Be sure to check that out. For Taylor, I'm Galen Clavio. You've been listening to Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.